Yep, there it is. Okay, got it. So, here we go. So, once everybody jumps in, we'll kind of pick up again. Sorry about that. So, your assignment for the week, I posted it up here. There's two videos. There's actually three videos up now that the AP World History group on College Board had made. It's a series of teachers kind of from around the country that have put together these things. They've put together these lessons. They're pretty interactive if you actually follow along with them when they're live. If you saw when they are, the live sessions, I believe it's that little link right there, and it's probably going to take an hour to pull up. But I believe they're at 6 o'clock on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. They're doing, I think, 3 a week for the remainder of the year. These are going to be kind of like nice little review things for later on. Right now, they're covering the rest of Unit 8, which is the Cold War, which is what we're going to talk about today, too. So your assignment was pretty straightforward. You're simply going to write like a one-page summary of what the Cold War was. So what does it actually consist of? And again, here it is. Yeah. So from 6 to 6:45, that's when their live stream is up for the actual World History Modern one. But yeah. So let's talk about the Cold War. So a couple things here. First off, I'm going to cover everything that's in essentially chapter 21 of the textbook that you guys all have at home. I know that this isn't going to be tested per se, in that it's not going to be on the actual AP test. But if the AP test is going to do an LEQ or any sort of essay portion, one of the points that's always available is for making connections to things outside of the time frame. So if you remember, whenever we talked about actually placing it in its place in history, you can talk about the things that happened before or after. So if they test you on anything about imperialism or anything like that, you can point out just how different Europe was and is before and after, or especially China, because as we'll talk about with communism, China is so we've got communism here. So yeah, your textbook standard Russian image of Lenin standing there behind the flag, and the rise of the Bolsheviks. So global communism, we've talked a little bit about already before, but essentially communism has its roots in 19th century socialism. So really trying to bank on everything in the 1800s that socialism would help create. Most European socialists came to believe that they could achieve their goals through the democratic process. Those who defined themselves as, quote, communists in the 20th century advocated for revolution. Communism in Marxist theory is the final stage of historical development, with the full development of social equality and collective living. It was thought to be, quote, the final form of what society was, where everyone was completely equal in every way, shape, and form. Now, we know that's not what actually ends up happening, but that is what the goal of it was. Almost 1/3 of the world's population was governed by communist regimes by the 1970s. The most important communist societies by far were the USSR and China. Communism also came to Eastern Europe, Mongolia, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, Afghanistan, but none of these countries had the industrial capitalism that Marx thought necessary for a socialist revolution. The communist parties took root in many other areas. There were small little branches of them kind of throughout, but those are the countries that everything really, really was fully embraced when it comes to communism. There are various expressions of communism shared by common ground. A common ideology based on Marxism was the inspiration of the 1917 Russian Revolution. But during the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact created a military alliance of Eastern European states and the USSR. The Council on Mutual Economic Assistance tied Eastern European economies to the USSR's economy, and the Treaty of Friendship between the USSR and China was very much something that was embraced. Communism was able to spread quite significantly because it did create such pacts and alliances kind of all throughout the countries that didn't have the ability to stand up. When it comes to relationships between communist countries, they were marked by two things: rivalry and hostility. Um, Everything was about trying to essentially become the greater power, because if you were the greater power, it meant that you had the collective greater good for your people as well. So, something to think of. Revolutions almost always were the path to communism. In Russia, there was revolution within a single year. So the Russian Revolution in 1917 was sudden, and it was explosive. The Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne in February of 1917. There was massive social upheaval, and because of that, we end up with a deep-seated social revolution that soon showed the inadequacy of the provisional government, which was the government that was set up in between the communists really taking over and the Bolsheviks really leading everything, and the Tsar before him, right? It would not / could not meet the demands of the revolutionary masses, and it refused to withdraw from World War I, which was kind of the whole reason for the revolution to start. This left an opening for the rise of more radical groups, and the most effective of which were the Bolsheviks. They were led by Vladimir Lenin. So the Bolsheviks seized power in a coup in October of 1917. They claimed to act on behalf of all of the Soviets. This was a 3-year civil war that followed. The Bolsheviks versus a variety of enemies. By 1921, though, the Bolsheviks, now calling their party the Communist Party, had won. During this 3-year civil war, the Bolsheviks regimented the economy, suppressed nationalist rebellions, committed atrocities, as did their enemies, integrated many lower-class men into the Red Army, and into local governments. They claimed to defeat Russia from imperialists as well as from internal exploiters. And they strengthened their tendency towards authoritarianism. Brian, your class is actually meeting tomorrow. Right now, I'm meeting with my AP classes on Mondays and Wednesdays, and I'm meeting with my honors and regular classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So you actually have a free period today, man. Enjoy it. And the opposite goes for all of my AP students that are in here. That means tomorrow there will not be a meeting for you guys during this time. So for 25 years, the new USSR was the only communist country. There was expansion into Eastern Europe thanks to the Soviet occupation at the end of World War II. And Stalin sought to get a buffer of, quote, friendly governments in Eastern Europe. He imposed communism from the outside. They had local communist parties and some domestic support. And in Yugoslavia, we see a communist government emerge with little Soviet help, which is one of the only countries that actually pops up without the Soviets helping them. The Russian Empire, as it was originally, essentially came all the way out to the edge here, to like the corner part of Manchuria, all the way back and across Ukraine, Poland, everywhere else. Abdullah, your class is meeting on Tuesday and Thursday. You don't have to be in here today. This is just for my AP class. Sorry for all the interruptions here, but there we go. So you'll also notice cut through here is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This railroad is actually still in use today. It has been very little updated too, which is also kind of wild to think. But it cuts all the way through from the actual heart of the country in Moscow all the way over to the coast. So it allows for the mass transportations of goods. And then we get to China. So China had a very different type of revolution. Communism was won in China in 1949 after a very long struggle. The Chinese imperial system collapsed in 1911, and that's when like the actual emperor falls and everything else kind of changes from there. But the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was not founded until 1921. Over the next 28 years, the CCP grew immensely and transformed its strategy under Mao Zedong. Kira, if you don't mind, can you mute your video so that way whenever I post this, your face doesn't pop up all over YouTube? Sorry. And for anyone else that jumped in late, whenever you jump in, it's going to have your audio and video muted. Please leave it that way, just for the sake of things. So Mao is going to be the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And when he takes over, they had a formidable enemy that actually arose within it called the Kuomintang. That was the Nationalist Party that ruled China after 1928, followed by, and I'm going to butcher these names, so I'm sorry, Chiang Kai-shek, who led the Kuomintang, and the Kuomintang promoted modern development, at least in cities, and the countryside remained impoverished. So you're going to see that, like, there was a nationalist party that originally did have the lead. Did I just like draw those on there? I didn't need to do that. But is that just my screen that's messed up? Oh. So after a long series of kind of fighting within, eventually the Chinese Communist Party was able to take over, right? After they did, the original Chinese Communist Party was driven from the cities, and it developed a new strategy. It looked to the peasants for support. So it wasn't looking for city workers. It was actually trying to gain support from the peasants. They only gradually won the respect and support of the peasants, but ultimately this is going to be what eventually gave them their support and their lead that they were able to use to become successful. They did recruit women, and they recruited women to make important reforms in regions that they had controlled. They outlawed arranged marriages. They made divorce easier. They gave women the right to vote and their own property. Women and men both received equal shares during early land reform initiatives, and women's associations were promoted. Male reactions led to some modifications. They started thinking everyone would be equal in every way, and that included men and women. They treated them equally. Given a boost by Japan's invasion of China, they gained a reputation for resisting Japanese occupation, and the Communist Party was significantly more effective than the Kuomintang at actually fighting back against the Japanese. The CCP addressed both foreign imperialism and peasant exploitation, and they expressed Chinese nationalism and a demand for social change. This gained them a reputation for honesty, which was quite rare by governments at the time. So there's Mao. Here he is. So within socialism, within all of these different forms of communism, it's important to remember that communism is the ultimate form of socialism, right? So within all of them, they do have a certain amount of pioneering when it comes to women's liberations. This is largely directed by the state. The USSR almost immediately declared full legal and political equality for women. Divorce, abortion, pregnancy leave, women's work were all enabled or encouraged. So they actually gave them full, equal, and in some cases better rights than anywhere else in the world at the time. In the USSR, the women actually got the right to vote significantly before American women. By 1919, the USSR's Communist Party set up Zenodel, or the Women's Department. This pushed a feminist agenda. The male communist officials and ordinary people often opposed it. When Stalin takes over, he abolishes it. He completely gets rid of it. Stalin didn't really see a point in women having rights because, as we'll talk about, he is very much a dictator. So communist China also worked for women's equality. The marriage law of 1950 ordered free choice in marriage. This was not something that was available for women in China before that. Women were forced into arranged marriages, whereas now they got free choice. It also ended the actual ability for concubinage, so women were no longer forced to be concubines. It outlawed child marriage. It also gave equal property rights to women. The CCP tried to implement pro-female changes against strong opposition. Women became much more active in the workforce as well. There were limitations on communist women's liberations. Stalin declared the women's question, quote, solved in 1930, and said that women had gotten everything they needed to get. There was no direct attack in either state on male domination within the family. Women still very much remained the burden of, took care of all of the housework and childcare, as well as going and actually doing paid employment. So women were going to work, and then after they were going to work, they still had to come home, take care of the house, raise the children. All of that was expected to be the women's role within the communist countries. Very few women made it into top political leadership. There are single-digit amounts of women that made it to the top of the ladder. Within here, you can see the Japanese conquests. I'm sorry. We'll start with the basic one. So within here, the communist areas before, sorry. The communist areas before were these little red dots that were communist before 1934. Then you'll see the actual Japanese conquest. So when Japan came into China and actually got into here before the end of World War II, Japan actually conquered everything all the way in here, including Nanking and Wuhan, which has been in the news recently for different reasons. In both states, the communists took landed estates and redistributed the land to peasants. In Russia, the peasants took and redistributed the land themselves. In China, land reform teams mobilized poor peasants to confront landlords and wealthier peasants. But both of them had the government redistribute land to people. There was a second stage of rural reforms. So there was an effort to end private property and land by collectivizing agriculture. In China, collectivization was largely peaceful. In the USSR, collectivization was imposed by violence. What that meant is no one was allowed to have their own private property. The government owned all of it. This was kind of meant that everything was done in a collective. Everything was done together. There was not a single person that actually had their own individual things. Everything was owned by the collective for the government. It wasn't owned by yourself. Both states regarded industrialization as fundamental. They both needed to end humiliating backwardness and poverty. They had a desire to create military strength and to survive in a hostile world. China largely followed the model established by the USSR. State ownership of property, centralized planning, in Russia's case, the 5-year plans. Priority was given to heavy industry. So the steel industry is going to be massive within the Soviet Union and also within China. There's a massive mobilization of resources, intrusive party control in the whole process, and both countries experienced major economic growth. The USSR leadership largely accepted the social outcomes of industrialization. In China under Mao, they tried to combat the social effects of this, which is called the, quote, Great Leap Forward. This promoted small-scale industrialization in rural areas, whereas the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution also rejected feminism for a strikingly masculine, gender-neutral model. Which meant that they kind of viewed everyone as being kind of an asexual comrade. That's why they got rid of Mr. and Mrs. and instead started calling everyone comrade. It was gender neutral. It didn't matter if you were male or female, as long as you were working to better society and better the government. They didn't care what gender you were. Throughout this time period, there was a great confidence in centralized planning. There was a struggle against nature that led to immense environmental damage. Chernobyl in 1986 very much is an example of this, where industry is given priority over everything. And very much so, the concept of what negative things would happen to nature are tossed to the side. There was no real thought into what the environmental aspects would be. Within this, there was a search for enemies throughout each one of them. within the Soviet Union and China under Stalin and Mao, there was a whole bunch of paranoia. There was fear that important communists were corrupted by the bourgeoisie ideas. They became class enemies, and there was a fear of vast conspiracies by these class enemies and foreign imperialists. These end in massive executions. The numbers are in the millions in terms of the amount of people that the Soviets and the Chinese both execute within their own party. So within the Soviet Union, you have the Terror, or the Great Purges of the 1930s. This enveloped millions of Russians, including tens of thousands of prominent communists. Many were sentenced to harsh labor camps, or the Gulag. If you've been playing Warzone, that's where the name comes from. Nearly 1 million people were executed between 1936 and 1941. And again, this is their own people. These are communists that are being killed by their own communist government. In China, the search for enemies was a public process. They had what they called the Cultural Revolution. It's where escaped control of communist leaderships. Mao had called for rebellion against the Communist Party itself, and he purged millions of supposed capitalist sympathizers. Mao had to call in the army to avert civil war. The number of people that Mao killed during this time period is far larger than we will ever know. There are no real accurate records, but it's safe to say that he killed probably in the tens of millions of people. Because he thought that they simply really liked capitalism on the inside and they were keeping it a secret. Both the Terror and the Cultural Revolution discredited socialism and contributed to the eventual collapse of the communist experiments. In both countries, they saw this as a reason why communism wasn't going to work. There was too much infighting and too much paranoia and fright for what could come from within. There wasn't enough trust within the government. And then we get to the Cold War. And we'll talk more about the Cold War too as we go throughout this and into kind of the office hours period. If you have questions about it, by all means, please come ask. So East versus West. Military conflict in the Cold War. Europe was the Cold War's first arena. The Soviet concern for security and control in Eastern Europe, and the American and British desire for open societies linked to the capitalist world economy. When this happened in World War II, part of the reason why this was able to occur is because the Russians were coming from the East. And as they came across, when they made it into Germany, they had built up a relationship with all of those countries that they kind of came through. Whereas on the West, the British, the French, and the Americans had also established their own set of relationships. So this kind of led to a weird divide. There was the creation of military alliances. NATO would be on one side, with the Americans essentially controlling that sphere. And that's the North Atlantic Trade Organization. And then you have the Warsaw Pact, which is going to be all of the Soviet countries. So this is going to compose of the Ukraine, Poland, East Germany, as well as the USSR. Within those, the Soviets very much controlled everything kind of going through it. And when this was imposed, they formed what is called the Iron Curtain that divided the two spheres. It cut Germany in half into East and West Germany. And from Germany to the east was controlled by the Soviets, and from Germany to the west was the Americans, quote unquote, running everything. Communism also spread into Asia. You got China, like we've been talking about, but you also have Korea and Vietnam. This led to quite a few conflicts. North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. And then in Vietnam, there's a massive U.S. intervention in the 1960s. Both of these were seen as attempts by capitalists and by the West to stop communism from spreading to other areas. Another major Cold War era conflict took part in Afghanistan. A Marxist party took power in 1978, but soon alienated much of the population. The Soviet military actually invades into Afghanistan. When they do this, they are met with very little success. The main reason for that is because the United States not only trained but also paid and supplied weapons for the actual people in Afghanistan, who were led by Osama bin Laden. He was actually one of the leaders that was there, and the United States gave him military training and weapons in order to fight back against the Russians as they advanced. Eventually, the USSR withdrew, and the Soviets leave Afghanistan in 1989. And when they do, the communist rule in Afghanistan collapses, and their country completely folds. This is part of the reason why there is an ongoing conflict in that part of the world with us. Within the United States, we paid for and trained a lot of the people in Afghanistan in hopes that they would fight off the Russians. But after they did, we just kind of left everything alone. We didn't help them rebuild. We offered support when they were fighting, but afterwards, we didn't, which is part of the reason why Afghanistan had major issues with the United States for the last several decades, because we essentially fought for the collapse of their government, but then didn't help them once they tried to start a new one. And then the battle that never happened, the biggest issue of them all, Cuba. So Fidel Castro comes into power in 1959. He gradually aligned himself with the Soviet Union, and the U.S., with all of its hostility towards the Communist Party, led to Khrushchev, who was at the time the leader of the Soviet Union, to send nuclear missiles to Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis happens in October in 1962, where essentially nuclear missiles were going to be placed on Cuba, on the Cuban border, which would have enabled the Russians to attack the United States directly. It is resolved in the end by the Soviet Union agreeing not to leave nuclear missiles there, and the U.S. agreeing not to invade Cuba. When all is said and done, the countries that are over here in green are going to be the ones that ended up aligning themselves with communism in some way, shape, or form. Everything from here over is all part of the Warsaw Pact. All of the ones in lighter green are part of just other communist countries. And then the countries that are in orange are NATO-based countries. Those are countries that are actually aligned with the United States. This leads to a massive nuclear standoff. The Soviet Union succeeded in creating a nuclear weapon in 1949, and it led to a massive arms race. By 1989, the world had nearly 60,000 nuclear warheads with complex delivery systems, which is more than enough to kill everyone on the world several times over. From 1949 to 1989, there was a fear of massive nuclear destruction and even the possible extinction of humankind. Both sides knew how serious their destructive power was, and they were careful to avoid any nuclear provocation, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Avoidance of any direct military confrontation also was an issue. They didn't want to actually fight Americans versus Soviets because it might turn into a nuclear war. Both the United States and the Soviet Union courted third world countries. The United States intervened in Iran, the Philippines, Guatemala, El Salvador, Chile, the Congo, and several other places because of the fear of communist penetration. The United States often supported corrupt authoritarian regimes, and many third world countries resisted because being used as pawns. Some countries, like India, claimed non-alignment status in the Cold War. They chose not to choose a side. They didn't pick the Americans, they didn't pick the Russians. When this happened, some tried to play off the superpowers against each other and got the United States and Russia to kind of fight off one another, to fight their own battles or bid up against each other as they went. There's an example of a nuclear explosion. That is a hydrogen bomb, which is significantly different and way more deadly than the actual atomic bombs that we dropped in Japan. There's Fidel Castro, who's the leader of the Cuban Communist Party, sitting right there. And we're getting towards the end here. So the United States eventually becomes the leader in the West against communism. It was led to the creation of the imperial presidency in the United States. Power was given to defense and intelligence agencies, creating the national security state. This is when things like the CIA and the NSA are all kind of created. It strengthened the influence of the military-industrial complex, and the U.S. military effort very much gets sustained by a flourishing economy. The United States comes out of World War II with arguably the strongest economy in the history of the world at the time, and ends up leading to an increasingly middle-class society. The U.S. industry hadn't been harmed by World War II. We didn't get bombed nonstop with other factories and other things, unlike every other major industrial society. Americans were a, quote, people of plenty. It was a growing place of U.S. investment abroad, and it very much spread their culture as well. So American popular culture also spread around the world. Jazz and rock and roll and rap all found foreign audiences. By the 1990s, American movies took about 70% of the European market. Around 33,000 McDonald's restaurants are in 119 countries by 2012. Nikita Khrushchev took power in the USSR in 1953, and in 1956, he denounced Stalin as a criminal. This is a big deal. The Cold War justified a continuing Soviet emphasis on military and defense industries, and essentially they had ruled that Stalin had acted in a criminal way, so thus he needed to be tossed out. You will notice that in the Soviet Union, every time a leader takes over, the first thing they tend to do is talk about how awful the person before them was, and it usually results in either jailing or executing. There's a growing conflict among the communist countries, though. Yugoslavia rejected Soviet domination, and the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia were done to crush these different revolutionary movements. In the early 1980s, that's when those happened. Poland was also threatened with invasion, but brutal suppression of reform tarnished the image of the Soviet communism. It was supposed to be something that brought everyone together, but it seemed to be more about one country gaining power over the rest. This gave credence to Western views of the Cold War as a struggle between tyranny and freedom. It very much set a sharp opposition between the communists in Russia and the Soviet Union, in China. China went to war against the communist Vietnam in 1979, and Vietnam invaded communist Laos late in the 1970s. World communism reached its greatest extent in the 1970s before eventually it comes back down. There's only about a minute left for this, so I'm going to try to be as quick as possible through the end of this. And again, I'll post all this up later if you missed part of it. So China eventually abandons communism. Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1976, and he relaxed censorship and released some 100,000 political prisoners. He dismantled the collectivized farming system, and China opened itself to the world economy. When this happens, the Chinese Communist Party keeps its political monopoly, which was a crushing of democracy. And in the late 1980s, we end up with the Tiananmen Square massacre. This leads to a, quote, strange and troubled hybrid. It combines nationalism, consumerism, and a new respect for ancient traditions, while also still maintaining some communist beliefs within China. And at the end of this, we end with the Soviet Union collapsing. And I know time's up, so if you got to run, I understand. Mikhail Gorbachev became the general secretary in the mid-1980s and launched the economic reform program called Perestroika in 1987. Also, he had glasnost, or openness, to greater cultural and intellectual freedoms. He opened up the Soviet Union to American and other Western things. Glasnost revealed what a mess the USSR was. It showed how much crime, prostitution, suicide, corruption, and the true extent of Stalin's atrocities were all uncovered. There was a new openness to religious expression, ending government censorship of culture, and there was also a bit of democratization. Free elections were held in 1989 for the first time. And there was a move to end the Cold War by making unilateral military cuts, negotiating arms controls, and eventually separating up the USSR into independent countries. And that ends up with all of these countries gaining their freedom, essentially. And that's that. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm just going to pop back to this for a second. I went through that super, super fast, and I understand if you're lost, confused, or disturbed by any of it. I'm going to try to post this up to YouTube in a second here, and I'll post the link so that way everyone can see it, go back, rewatch it if you need to. This information can certainly help when it comes to writing up your summary. And then every day from 1 to 3, I will be sitting in a Zoom session, just sitting here. If you have questions, whenever you jump in at that time, I have all the time in the world to answer all the questions that you guys have. So if you have questions about things, please come by to like the personal meeting session. I posted the link up in Edsby. I know Edsby's been acting up for everybody, but we'll try to make the most out of this. If you got to run to go to your next class, I understand. I'm going to take the next like 8 or 9 minutes here to just kind of sit and answer questions if you have them. So if you have any questions, by all means, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask them. If you don't have any questions, you can leave. That's fine. I hope you guys all have a great day. Yeah, Shahad, I saw you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, for the attendance, since Edby's down, so it doesn't matter what time we do it, right?
Yeah, so like Saturday, we got an update about attendance stuff, and essentially only second period needs to have their attendance log now, and it's going to be once a week, not every day, which is very different from what we got told originally. Yeah, don't worry about it. It's okay. It doesn't really matter for first period. For my second period people, I'm gonna reopen that assignment and try to change it and edit it. So that way, essentially, it'll be open all week. And at any point during the week, you just have to click the button that says, yes, I was here. And that's it. Abdullah, it says you have your hand raised. And I'm still wondering why you're here. But go ahead.
So, do we write some of this, or did we just have to walk pretty much?
Say that again?
So, do we have to write a summary for this, or did we just have to watch it?
So, Abdullah, this is just for my AP classes. That's why, like I said that earlier. So, like my regular and honors classes, you guys have a very different assignment, a different book, and different everything. So, if you're going to post my regular and honors classes, I'm just meeting with you guys on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Tuesdays and Thursdays only?
Yep.
Okay. No.
No problem. Anybody else have any other questions or anything they want to ask before they run to their next class? Looking around, got no hands. All right. Well, then, without any further ado, I'm going to pause this. I'm going to post it up onto YouTube whenever I can, and I'll post the link for everybody else. I'll be back from 1 to 3. By all means, please jump on, ask questions. Don't be afraid, and I'll talk to you guys later.